We have to remember it because now it is under threat again because of an election coming up April 1 in this state. Explain why now there's potentially a risk here.
Yeah, the wild part too is you say the Supreme Court, well, what changed in the law? Well, nothing.
Right.
The Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld this law years ago. A federal judge upheld this law. It's been through the courts multiple times. Nothing changed in the law. What changed was liberals, people like Eric Holder, nationally, George Soros and others who poured money in the last couple races in Wisconsin, systematically said that they couldn't change it through electing a new legislature. They couldn't change it just by electing a new governor. So they decided to go to the courts. And in this case, they've won the last several elections, the latest being 2 years ago in 2023, where for the first time ever, we had a candidate who ran essentially a congressional-style campaign, telling us all but saying, this is how I'm going to rule on these issues. Unprecedented.
It's like campaign promises.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Today's episode is going to be a little different because we have Guy Benson, who's a radio host and Fox News contributor, sitting down with former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. They will discuss his time in office and one of his signature legislative achievements, Act 10, which aimed to rein in government spending by scaling back collective bargaining for most public employees, but could potentially be repealed. Act 10 was passed 14 years ago and has had multiple challenges in court, but due to an upcoming Wisconsin Supreme Court election, that could all change. In fact, one of my first experiences as an AFP state director was loading up 5 buses of activists to drive up to Wisconsin and ask voters to keep Act 10. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Governor Walker, it's great to see you. It's great to be here in your state.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Last time I saw you was last year in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I come here a lot, as it turns out, and it's a wonderful place, and it's actually a really important political battleground every year, including this year. I think I actually talked about this on my show, wrote about it. There is such an important election in Wisconsin that many people around the country, and even a lot of people in Wisconsin, haven't really tuned into or heard much about. There's a lot at stake. Let's talk about the policy that's at stake. We had these conversations, well over a decade ago. This fight that you had, all the protests, the threats, et cetera, the recall, over reforms. That was a policy fight. You won the fight. A lot of real progress was made in this state that's now potentially in jeopardy. Talk about Act 10. We have to relitigate this now. Talk about Act 10, what it was, and why it helped.
Yeah. And the funny part is, even though it's gone through every level of the courts, nothing's changed in the law except for the politics of state Supreme Courts, we'll talk about in a moment. But simply put, what Act 10 did was taking the power out of the hand of the big government union bosses, the special interests, and putting it back into the hands of the hardworking taxpayers. And in particular, the taxpayers and the people they elect to run their schools, like I once was a county executive, their county governments and municipal governments and their state government. Before Act 10, most local officials really deferred, because of the union contracts, to the union leaders. And so whether it was in pay, compensation, that drove their budgets up. It's why property taxes went up by double digits year after year before I was governor. But more importantly, in terms of even in how they ran their schools or the local governments. And by shifting the power, we allowed, if you elect someone to a school board, for example, those people, the majority of those school board members, now make the decisions about what happens in the school. And that's had a tremendously positive impact. According to MacGyver Institute, more than $31 billion worth of savings to the taxpayers. I think more importantly, it's the ability to staff based on merit and to pay based on performance, which means, like everybody else in the private sector, we can put the best and the brightest in those positions.
There is also this element of finally having government workers paid for their salaries by taxpayers contribute something to retirement to actually make the system solvent, and sustainable. You look at some of your neighbors. I think of one neighbor particular to the south. We won't mention them, but I lived there for a while. Complete mess, an absolute broken basket case. And you guys said, we can't do that here. Let's make it sustainable. It is still far more generous than what a lot of private sector people deal with, but they kind of freaked out about it. I remember during the debate, all of the parade of horribles, right? They made all these predictions about the Armageddon that would befall Wisconsin if this became law. Talk about what they said versus what actually happened.
It said there'd be a mass exodus of teachers, that the schools would fall apart, that things would just be awful. The irony is a lot of those protesters who came in, almost 100,000 at one point occupied our state capitol, not for a couple hours, but for nearly a month. Many of them came from Illinois and elsewhere across the country. The irony is today, our retirement system is fully funded, the best funded in the nation. Theirs is the worst. Illinois and California compete for the bottom of the barrel when it comes to that. It's why economically they also have low rankings there. But it was more than that. And I said the schools are going to be devastated. I think part of the reason why I won the recall a year later was because people could see their kids went back to school and the schools were the same or better. They got their property tax bills that December, the first year I was in office, and the property taxes went down for the first time in decades. They could actually see it. They could understand it. And today, all these years later, not exactly the place you'd expect it, not exactly Hillsdale or Fox News, but the University of California, Berkeley, one of the graduate students there did a research statistics study on students in the classroom and how they performed, whether after Act 10, whether the teacher was opted to be in a union or not. And not surprisingly, the students who were in classrooms without unionized teachers actually fared much, much better. Exactly what we said would happen.
So it's interesting, if you broaden it out to the national stage, we're having a debate in the country about extending or making permanent the 2017 Trump tax cuts, which were really great for the economy. And the left made a bunch of predictions about how horrible it would be, and it's only for billionaires and all that. It was just total nonsense. The economy was in great shape until COVID. And now there's this deadline coming up, and if it's not extended, if these tax cuts are not extended, it'll be a $4+ trillion tax increase across the board on the American people. The reason I bring that up in this context is there would be a real consequence to families if that successful policy goes away. Here in Wisconsin, if Act 10 does go away, let's say, and we'll talk about this election, this judicial election coming up April 1st. Let's say there's a progressive left-wing majority on the Supreme Court, and they decide to roll back the clock, to use a phrase that they like to use, to wipe away what you guys did in Act 10 that has been the succeeding status quo in this state now for years. What would the consequences look like for students, for families, for taxpayers, and for the state?
It's the worst of all scenarios because they would pull it back, but it wouldn't change other circumstances. So what you'd have is the 1-2 negative punch of property taxes going up, some say by as much as $1,000 per a $300,000 home, which is a pretty basic home here in the state of Wisconsin. So
because now you have to be funding all of these benefits and stuff by the taxpayers again.
What will happen is people forget, it wasn't just paying a little bit more for health care, although most school district employees paid nothing. So now they're paying maybe $25-$50 a paycheck.
That's
shocking to what the rest of us think, right? And so, but we even allowed them to bid out things like their health insurance. Talk about a scam. The teachers union had a health insurance company affiliated with them that through their contracts, almost every school district in the state of Wisconsin had to buy their health insurance there. Once we bid it out.
It's like a corrupt scheme.
Totally. I mean, it's like racketeering. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So a lot of school districts saved money, not just by having employees pay, but by bidding this health insurance out, by doing things that were more creative. All those options now are suddenly frozen. The school boards go back to where they were before. So on top of the property taxes going up, this is the part that really I don't think people here in Wisconsin, certainly elsewhere in the country, fully understand or grasp, is that it will suck money out of the classroom. So even people say, I don't mind about higher property taxes. It's all about the kids. In this case, it's not about the kids. The students will see money out of the classroom, go to bigger benefits, bigger things for the unions, union dues, things of that nature. So it will have a devastating impact on multiple levels here in the state of Wisconsin. The other interesting thing that does compare to what you were just saying with the president, and I hope they do make those tax cuts permanent, because every time we've seen tax cuts under Coolidge, Kennedy, Reagan, and now Trump, you've seen actually the benefit go overwhelmingly to the working class, to the working men and women of this country.
And by the way, I jump in, Americans for Prosperity is at the center of that fight in Washington, D.C.
Forefront of that here and across the country.
Yep.
But that's why it's so important. What I learned years ago here was the protesters in America have a right to be heard. That's what's great about this country. As long as you legally and responsibly protest, you can take on your government. You can push back without fear of retribution like we see in communist and socialist nations around the world. But that said, just because a bunch of people show up in my capital or the nation's capital or even at town hall meetings doesn't mean the noise of the protesters should drown out the voices of the taxpayers.
Well, you had a line about that, right? Because you were asked by a reporter, what about the 100,000? Because that's an impressive showing. Right. Even if they're being bussed in from other states, it's a lot of people. And you said, yeah, I can hear them, but, and then you had this line about you had the exact number of votes you want.
Exactly. I mean, that's the kicker, is there's nearly 1.2 million people voted for me to do what I was doing at that time, the same way they voted for Donald Trump and the members of Congress to do what they're doing. And that's the part people get, many in the media, not you, but many others sometimes, oh, look at all these protests. Well, everyday Americans across the political spectrum, by and large, are at work, they're at school, they're retired, they're doing things that aren't focused on protesting, and either end of the spectrum. And so we have to be mindful of what did they send us to do? And in our case, they sent us to get the job done, and it worked.
I'm always amazed by the amount of time some people have to protest. I don't think I've ever been to one. Like if I was like, I've got 15 minutes. I'm going to go protest for 15 minutes, let alone 15 days. It's wild.
Well, a lot of these people, you see it more than one protest.
Yeah, they're familiar faces.
Flip the sign.
Right, they're
That's
kind
why
of,
when you ask them, like from the river to the
groupies.
sea, and they say, well, what sea is that? They don't know.
Yeah, what river? They're protest groupies, right? Which is sort of traveling the country. I remember distinctly the build up to the recall election, and it really felt like there was so much at stake that day. Yeah. And I remember one of our competitors, I'm at Fox, one of our competitors did their broadcast from here that night with big expectations for their desired outcome, which they did not get. And that was sort of enjoyable to watch the meltdown that ensued. But throughout the protest, there was sort of this staccato chant that your critics over and over again would chant together, which is, this is what democracy looks like, over and over again as they protested. And famously, when you guys won the recall election, beat them again, an affirmation of what you guys had done, your lieutenant governor at the time got up and said, this is what democracy looks like. So that was a huge win. The law was upheld multiple times at various levels of the courts, and yet, here we are years later. Like, I can't believe I had to go back in the memory bank to think, what was I arguing? Why were we arguing about what Act 10? What were the points? We have to remember it because now it is under threat again because of an election coming up April 1 in this state. Explain why now there's potentially a risk here. Yeah, the wild part too is you say the Supreme Court. Well, what changed in the law? Well, nothing. Right. The Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld this law years ago. A federal judge upheld this law. It's been through the courts multiple times. Nothing changed in the law. What changed was liberals, people like Eric Holder, nationally, George Soros and others who poured money into the last couple races in Wisconsin, systematically said that they couldn't change it through electing a new legislature. They couldn't change it just by electing a new governor. So they decided to go to the courts. And in this case, they've won the last several elections, the latest being 2 years ago in 2023, where for the first time ever, we had a candidate who ran essentially a congressional-style campaign, telling us all but saying, this is how I'm going to rule on these issues. Unprecedented. It's like campaign promises, but a judge. And well, I didn't, well, if you say you think it's unconstitutional, how do you not say that that's not telling the voters how you're going to rule on things like Act 10 and other issues out there? So she wins. They now have 2 years ago, 23. They now have and outspin her opponent by like 6-7 to 1. Not surprisingly, days after she takes the oath of office as the newest justice, the union bosses file a suit. And that flipped ideological control of the court, right? So they file a suit to pull back, to claim that Act 10, which has already been upheld, is now unconstitutional. They go a decade later, more than a decade later? Yeah, a dozen years or so after it's been upheld through all that. And then they find a judge in the most liberal county in the state, Dane County, to say it is, and then ultimately it's going to work its way to the court. Now you said, well, it's already 4-3, why wouldn't they act this? Well, Ann Walsh Bradley, who's one of the four, has been in the court a quarter century. Even though she's left of center, she still believes in precedent. She still understands the court ruled on this. She's the one who's retiring. She's retiring. And so now you potentially have a fourth activist, brazen political activist who's going to be on this court.
They throw that out. They throw out voter ID. They redraw boundaries for House seats. You could have as many as 2 Republican-held seats today. It'd be going. All these things aren't projections. These are things that have been either said directly by the candidate running or by people on her behalf.
One footnote, because you mentioned there was a judge in Madison who decided all of a sudden, oh yeah, it's unconstitutional, right? That judge was involved in the recall campaign against you.
Exactly.
Right?
Actually signed the petition.
Explicitly
Didn't just have a position. And remember, a recall is unique. It's not even saying I'm signing someone's nomination papers or I'm casting a ballot. You're saying I'm so upset.
I want to undo an election.
I want to stop this this term and throw you out in the middle of it.
And that judge signed the recall petition, and then years later was given this opportunity.
It'd be like a criminal judge saying, I signed a petition saying Joe Smith should get the death penalty, but I didn't really rule on that. Well, of course you did. You stated exactly what your position is. But that's what we're up against.
And therefore, depending on how this race goes April 1st, if there is a 4-3, not just left-leaning majority, but aggressive activist left majority, they can start taking a blowtorch not just to Act 10 and all the negative ramifications that would flow from that going away, but other elements of successful governance that were implemented under you and beyond, right?
You go down the line, the REINs Act, which took power out of the bureaucracy.
Let's talk about the REINs Act. Let's linger there for a second before we touch on the other stuff, because there's a big discussion around the REINs Act in Washington, D.C. I was at a conference in Florida just a few days ago, and someone was really going to bat for a federal REINs Act. So for non-policy wonks, I'm guessing that a lot of people who might be watching this podcast or listening, they're probably policy wonks. But just in case, the REINs Act, give us a sense of what that was here in Wisconsin and how it's worked in Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's been phenomenal. But at the state level, it's even worse, as you can imagine, in Washington. If anyone who's ever had any modest interaction with the government knows there are laws that either a legislature or Congress act on, but a good chunk of what people, particularly small business owners, have to deal with are things that are done through the administration, through the executive branch, that have the force of law, but no one who's been elected actually votes on them. And so this reins that in. This takes the power out of the unelected bureaucracy and put it back in the hands of people who are duly elected. Now, some people might say...
It's like reigning in the administrative state.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally. I mean, it's in Washington, it's reigning in the deep state, just reign in the swamp, as they would say there. In our case, it had a phenomenal effect. I know governors instinctively have been slow to come to this because it's a little bit about taking some of executive power and putting it in the legislative branch. But the reason for that is you want checks and balances through people who are elected. And so while we gave that up, the good news is, even though Tony Evers, the current governor, who's, again, the Democrat, I mean, talk about how woke he is. He just talked about changing the law from mother to inseminated person.
Yes, inseminated person really rolls off the tongue.
He's just right out there. But this law allowed or protected the hardworking people of the state multiple times because the power was put back in the hands of the legislative body to have a check and a balance on this administrative state.
And you can point to wins in Wisconsin under the REINs Act.
And AFP has been at the forefront of doing that here in Wisconsin, and certainly we'd love to see them help do that in other states, and particularly in our nation's capital.
All right, so that's the REINs Act. What else?
But that would be going. That's another one of those things.
The Supreme Court could just say, all that democracy that's been building up for years, we don't like some of the outcomes of that, so we're just going to decide that the Constitution of Wisconsin prohibits it?
Undo Act 10, which has already been upheld in court.
Right.
There's no reason why you can't move the bar on anything else. Even things, I mean, get this, I think a lot of people nationally don't realize this. Even something like the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, the first voucher program in the country 35 years ago, could potentially be at risk. There have been people claiming for years that this is unconstitutional. Again, even though it's been upheld in state federal court.
Do we know the union's position on that?
Yeah, there's just no reason why, right to work, the freedom to choose whether you want to be in a union or not. I signed that in the law. All these things could be undone to the point where, realistically, it's not a leap to say, why would someone run for governor of the legislature if you've got this mega rule-making, law-making body in the 4 members of the Supreme Court?
Right, that has the final say on everything, right? It's like these super elections, which is what you had to face huge numbers of voters multiple times, right? And whatever happens April 1st, it's in April of an off year, right? It's not as many people participating in the process. So if they're really worried about democracy and representation, the bigger elections with more people having a say, I think maybe might have some supremacy. But in this case, if they can have these off-year elections where the left is extra energized, this is where kind of the political side of it comes in. So speaking only for myself here, it seems like when the left and their activists are energized and focused on something, they sometimes have an advantage because conservatives say, oh, well, look, the presidency went the way that it did, and I'm busy, and I got kids and work and all that stuff. That's a mentality that advantages hardcore activist left-wingers.
Absolutely. Well, and I hear it all the time. People say, well, President Trump carried Wisconsin. It's, I forget, it is the most purple states in America. In the last 25 years, no battleground state has been closer in every major election than the state of Wisconsin. Whether it's the presidential election, governor's election, U.S. Senate, election after election, we're that close. And so for those people who did vote for President Trump, there's a huge percentage of them that don't historically vote in the spring elections.
Well, some of them didn't vote for the Senate candidate in 2024.
Right, exactly.
Right, and that ended up being...
So that's one of those where hopefully it's an eye-opener that even on something like securing the border, it's not a stretch to say that you might not have a state Supreme Court that would try to block actions by ICE and other federal officials here in the state of Wisconsin, which would affect or push back on fentanyl and other issues. Certainly, you look just at the political dynamics as an observation. I think it's not a stretch because, again, you've seen at least several of the proponents of one of the candidates explicitly say in an invitation for a political event that they would gain 2 seats in the House. So 2 seats would flip.
In the U.S. House.
In the U.S. House.
Redraw their lines.
So think about last week. It was 217, 215 on that vote on the framework of the House budget. You could actually have a change before 2026 in the House. And if you get rid of voter ID.
That's my next question, because this is the thing. I had you on my radio program recently, and we talked about these issues for 2 full segments. And I sort of asked rhetorically out loud, all right, we love Scott Walker. Wisconsin's an important state. Why are we doing half an hour on a state level race in Wisconsin? Well, because it's not just Wisconsin that's affected. Overwhelmingly, this is where it's going to happen. Right. But there are implications nationally as well, which brings us to voter ID. This is a common sense reform that, most people are stunned to learn that it's not the case anywhere, right? You show voter ID so you can vote. That could be on the chopping block here under a radical Supreme Court because they've been fighting it forever. And you talk about those very close voter margins in some of these races, something like jettisoning voter ID could tip races.
Oh, without a doubt. There's just no doubt about it. It's ironic, the Marquette University Law School poll, so the biggest statewide poll here in Wisconsin, just came out this week. It showed overwhelming bipartisan support. Republican, Independent, Democrats, overwhelmingly.
Like 3 out of 4, right? It was like...
It's just logical, right? Who doesn't think... You have to be really an extreme partisan to somehow not think that this makes sense. And yet, boom, that could be completely out. And you can see why. Every state that former Vice President Kamala Harris carried in the last election was a state without voter ID. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them. So they take a state that has been, the last couple cycles, out of almost 6 million people, it's been about 25,000 votes. You're talking on average about 1 on average per ward. Suddenly now, if you don't have voter ID, it opens the door.
It's a safeguard gone.
Yeah, it's just poof. Suddenly now Wisconsin's no longer a battleground state. And again, if you're just an independent voter, one, it just makes sense to do that. But secondly, why would you not want to have the candidates come here to hear from people, to be the state that matters in the end? If you get rid of voter ID with a court that switches that way, it's gone.
Yeah, and you were referencing the poll here in the state. Off the top of my head, it was something like 76% support for a voter ID. And that's very typical across the country. Right. But if you have 4 people out of 7 on one court who are part of the 26%, that's the ballgame.
Right. When they're on the court, doesn't matter. It's they're up once a decade, so they're not exactly wigged out about that. They're going to do what they're going to do because it's in their self-interest. Even if they want to run again, it makes it easier for them to run again in the future.
And they also just have an agenda, right? There's an ideological agenda. They want to impose it, and it's up to voters to decide if they're going to be allowed to do that. And I think if you had a strong, this is my belief at least, if you really had a strong focus on the issues that we're talking about, I think the correct side would prevail here just in terms of the issues. Yeah. The problem is so many people are still tuned out, even in this state. I know a ton of money is going to flow in here and people are seeing the ads and stuff, but we're weeks away. So what would your closing argument be to Wisconsin voters, not about who to vote for, they can go do their research and decide for themselves, but in terms of what's on the line here, the principles, the policies, what would you say to voters who either are undecided or not even sure if they're like going to participate?
Yeah. I'd say everything is on the line. The things that have put us on the right track are overwhelmingly at stake in this election. But even higher than that, philosophically, as kids, we learned about the three branches of government. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enacts them. The governor signs them. The president signs them. But they carry them out. And then the judicial branch upholds the Constitution and the rule of law. And when I was governor, I actually appointed people to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the Circuit Court. I said that was my premise. I wanted people of integrity, people who knew the law, but most importantly, people understood that their role as a judge or a justice was to uphold the Constitution and those laws duly enacted within it, no more, no less. That's what we should want. That's what we should vote for in this state, is someone who's going to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, not make it be what you want it to be. You want to do that, you run for the legislature, you run for the governor. I think that's the fundamental premise out of all this, is if you don't want a bunch of people who don't have routine direct accountability to the voters making decisions for you, if you want a handful to make decisions for all the rest of us, if you don't want that, you got to vote in this election, and you got to determine who's the candidate who's going to take power away from you and who's the candidate who's going to uphold the rule of law.
Tuesday, April 1st, coming fast. Governor Scott Walker, it's so good to see you.
Good to see you, Guy.
Thanks so much.
Well, we want to thank Guy and Governor Walker for taking time to sit down and talk about what would happen if Act 10 in Wisconsin were to be repealed. By allowing the public sector unions to have collective bargaining power again, it could lead to increased taxes for taxpayers and potential budget challenges for the state. Hopefully that won't happen, but we'll have to wait and see. If you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.